It's Wednesday, April 5th, 2023, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me this week are my colleagues, Kathy Kiely and Keith Greenwood, who's in this week for Ernest Perry. On our program, we're going to be talking about the coverage of former President Trump's arraignment in a New York state court. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's profiled on 60 Minutes, was Leslie Stahl too easy on her? And it's baseball season again. The games are a bit faster this year thanks to the new pitch clock, and they're expecting lots more stolen bases. But it's kind of unclear from some of the national reporting just how big those bases are. We'll explain. There's actually a lot more that we hope to get to today before our half hour is up. But first, we're going to talk about Evan Gershkovich. He is the Wall Street Journal reporter who was arrested in Russia and is being held on charges of espionage. And right now, the chances of him being released quickly are looking pretty grim. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has urged the top Russian diplomat to release the journalist, that he's a journalist. He is not a spy. And Kathy, I know this is something you've been very vocal about this case. Tell us about Evan. Help our audience understand more about who he is, what he stands for, what he was doing in Russia.
Well, he's a young journalist. He's in his 30s. He's the son of Russian emigres. So by all accounts, he became very enamored of his parents' homeland. He obviously speaks Russian fluently. And he's been living in Russia and really volunteered, went out of his way to go there, left a job at the New York Times so that he would have the opportunity to report from Russia, and gradually rose through the ranks, worked at the Moscow Times, which was an English language paper there, and then moved up to eventually work at the Wall Street Journal. He was on an assignment for the Journal when he was arrested. And really, I think this is a sign of how far this Russia has devolved. I mean, this is really in some ways worse than the Soviet Union, because Russia's really become a rogue state where citizens of other countries aren't safe. I mean, this is under Putin. It's a state that crosses borders to try to assassinate its citizens in other countries. Now it is actually holding a journalist hostage as a bargaining chip. So really no foreigner is going to be safe working in this country right now, and I think that's why you see a lot of Americans pulling out. It started before Gershkovich, and he volunteered to stay, so he knew the risks involved. But this is it's hostage taking, plain and simple.
Yeah, and he definitely had a sense of there were things there that he could report on that Russian journalists couldn't because of the restrictions that have been placed on them. So, you know, having the ability perhaps to, as I saw one of the stories, tell the stories that nobody else could tell was certainly, laudable and something we want to do. But it's kind of not a stretch to see where the Russian authorities would have said, okay, we need to quiet this guy down.
Well, I think this really shows, you see, it happens all the time in cases like this. The journalists who love the countries the most and care the most about getting those stories out are the ones who pay the heaviest price. Mm-hmm. It's really ironic and a horrible thing.
So we watched for months as efforts were made to negotiate Brittany Griner's release, and in the end, watching her go free while Paul Whelan still sits in prison. There are more parallels, though, between Gershkovich and Whelan than there were Brittany Griner.
Yeah, because both men have been charged with espionage, and so I think it's just going to be, whereas Griner was charged with a minor drug offense. But I think this is the difficulty. I mean, clearly the Biden administration is working hard to get both men out. But this is the problem, that the more you give up, the more it motivates people like Putin to take another hostage. Mm-hmm. And so it's a terrible situation for the country to be in. And the Wall Street Journal has pulled out its longtime bureau chief in Moscow. And really, you saw last year, after Putin said, calling a war was a treasonous offense, you saw a lot of American journalists leave because I think people anticipated something like this happening.
So what can people here do to support Evan, to support the efforts of the Wall Street Journal, the Biden administration, to support him, support his family, support the cause of his release?
Well, the Journal is pulling out all the stops, and they are all over social media. I think reposting, retweeting, engaging with their content. They sponsored a tweet storm this morning. So they are really working hard. The hashtag is #IStandWithEvan. And I think the more his name can be kept out there, that he's not forgotten, I think the better off he'll be.
And within the profession, I know there are a lot of professional organizations that are pushing those initiatives. And so, within journalism, certainly there are a lot of things that can be done to support. As far as the general public, as Kathy said, tweeting, hashtag, just kind of keeping that at the front and center.
Yeah, I think the point you made, Keith, is really a good one, because the solidarity among journalists has been enormous on this. And you're seeing organizations running the gamut from the New York Times, a competitor of the Wall Street Journal, to Fox News, running stories about this. And the idea, obviously, is to keep his name out there. So he knows he's not forgotten, and so does Vladimir Putin.
Well, and the National Press Club, an organization that you and I are both members of, we're getting sometimes 2 and 3 and 4 emails a day about efforts that the press club have been involved with.
Absolutely.
As well.
And so all of these, I think, are really important. And that members of the general public can just follow those organizations and repost their social media.
Okay. Well, as I was writing the show yesterday, I had the TV on over my shoulder, watching the loop of former President Donald Trump walking into the New York courthouse to hear the 34 felony charges of falsifying business records that were filed against him. There has been a lot of coverage on this going back 2.5 weeks ago to when Trump said he was going to get indicted, then didn't, and then from Thursday when it came out that the indictment had been handed down. And I want to focus a lot of our conversation on the coverage of the past really 36 hours, but even going further back to last Thursday, there were some moments, especially as we talk about history, Keith, like I felt like I was watching the OJ slow speed chase again for a good chunk of Monday and a good chunk of yesterday. There was even a tweet from Eric Trump sitting inside the plane, watching the coverage of the plane on the tarmac in Florida, because we literally were trained on those vehicles for 2 days.
And that's come up in some of the stories and social media, been referred to as that slow speed chase, and especially the motorcade through Manhattan from Trump Tower to the courts. But certainly, yeah, there's been just sort of this play out of there's not a lot really new going on here. Where's the car now? But certainly, well, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? What's going to happen? But only so much that anyone had to talk about.
Well, in between Thursday, since the indictment was sealed, until that court hearing was over yesterday, there wasn't a whole lot to talk about. It was the fact that there was an indictment, that there was going to be a hearing, and that it was going to be at 2:15 Eastern time yesterday, and that we would not find out what the charges were until after the hearing, and that cameras weren't going to be allowed into the courtroom. Let's talk about that part for a second. Kathy, let me ask you this, especially as our chair in free press studies. How do we feel about that?
Well, I mean, I did see a picture today of
There's one
Trump.
pool. There are a few pool photos.
I think that's perfectly fine. And frankly, I mean, I really hate to say it. I think the last 2 weeks have been an embarrassment to our business.
Okay, let's talk about why.
I think this is an argument for pool coverage. And I think the media should initiate it. Yes, we should cover it when a former president of the United States is charged criminally. Absolutely. But as you've alluded to, Trump Inc. has played, and that's okay, it's allergy season. Trump Inc. has played the media like a fiddle, as they have before. We have learned absolutely nothing. And I think that the problem here is, what's the story? A guy is getting indicted.
Hey, as it said in the Queensboro newspaper, the headline was literally Queens man indicted.
Queens man indicted.
That's what happened.
There you go. I love
Queens
that.
Got indicted.
All news is local. But I really think what we could do instead of this wall-to-wall. I mean, I saw a photo of reporters and camera people lined. I mean, you couldn't see the end of the line to cover. Maybe get a glimpse of Donald Trump from miles away. And I couldn't help but think to myself, how much reporting power was being devoted to the same damn story when we could be covering how to solve the housing crisis in America, how to solve the healthcare crisis in America, how to solve income inequity in America. There are a host of problems. How to solve the drug addiction crisis. There are a host of problems. Now, the problem is that if we ran the lead story as how to solve the housing crisis in America, how many people are going to watch that as opposed to some long-distance shot of Donald Trump? So it's not just the media, it's all of us who consume the media, but we really need to get a grip on ourselves. We are, to use the great Neil Postman line, distracting ourselves to death. Mm-hmm. It's just sick, and I don't mean that in the good sense of the word.
Well, there's certainly a lot to be said for pulling back on the coverage. There were a lot of other stories that could have been covered since last Thursday, a lot more attention that could have been played onto things. I don't know how many times I heard the unprecedented in history line kind of a thing. Okay, fine, we get it.
It's like trying to justify your own wall-to-wall coverage.
Right. And, to be able to say, I get what you're saying about these are things that could be a pool, and do we need a block's worth of reporters all standing shoulder to shoulder so that organizations can say our person is there? Probably not. But as long as we operate in a competitive journalistic environment, that's going to be the go-to. But for those organizations also to say, kind of like they did last night, yeah, this is happening. Here's everything else that's happening. And you make a point about, well, what is the audience going to tune into? And I think there's something to be said for, well, they'll tune into what we present,
exactly.
What organizations present.
Let's start using our news judgment.
So talking about last night in news judgment, I was that person with the remote control, switching channels and seeing what was going on. And the event last night in Florida when Trump spoke, Fox News took it live, CNN took it live, MSNBC didn't. NPR didn't. NPR had actually said on Thursday that they would no longer be taking any comments from Donald Trump live, that they know and understand and believe as an organization that that it is all now being used as campaign fodder, and that they will cover it, but through screening before any of it is put on air, which speaks to that idea of pulling back and to determine what is truly newsworthy and what isn't.
Well, that's the good point. What is news here versus somebody is talking? And I think CNN did bail out.
Midtown.
They did, because at one point I had to run out last night and was listening on satellite radio, and at one point you heard Anderson Cooper like, okay, he's not talking about anything that happened today anymore. We're going to go.
Right.
Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, she was among those people who were protesting on the courthouse steps yesterday, even if some New Yorkers did tell her to go home. Sunday night, she was front and center, profiled in a segment on 60 Minutes, and some say that Leslie Stahl threw her one too many softballs, not holding her to account for some of her more outrageous beliefs. So when we talk about whether or not she's newsworthy, Keith, should 60 Minutes have taken the time to showcase her in such a manner in the way that they did?
There's a tricky answer.
Yeah.
I lean toward no.
Okay.
She's certainly become an important figure in Congress, especially with the current structure of the House and the party that's in charge and the leadership. She has gained a lot of power. And so from that sense, yeah, it's probably worth paying some attention to her, but I don't know that I would have done it in the way that 60 Minutes did.
Talk about why.
Because I don't think it was really reported as much on the power, the structure, the politics, the news. It was done a little more, as kind of a feature on, hey, let's get to know this person. Nothing wrong with that, but I think in this instance, putting the focus on this is what this person is doing, and this is where this person came from, and certainly conducting an interview and giving some chance to put her opinion in or explain, respond to some charges and so on would have been appropriate. But I think approaching it more as a news story as opposed to kind of a profile
folksy type of thing. Kathy, what was your reaction to it?
This is one of those cases that really challenges journalistic norms. I mean, what 60 Minutes did is right down the line with journalistic norms. A woman in the news, let's put her on the air and see what she's all about. But again, and we've talked about this before, what do we do? I mean, our norms are based on the fact that people we cover are going to be, for the most part, truthful. If you have somebody who has an active record of lying and saying really crazy things, I mean, somebody who really seems to have spirals where her eyeballs should be. Is that the person you showcase? And I think increasingly this has become a real problem. Now, interestingly, one of our own alums from MUJ School, Major Garrett, who has a podcast, he's a senior correspondent for CBS, he has made a decision on his podcast. He will not feature anyone who voted to overturn the 2020 election. So that's a gutsy move, but I think you see more and more people sort of saying, how do we draw the line? Because again, as we were just talking, the media, if we abide by our norms, they can be used against us. And this is an example of the tools of democracy being used to undermine democracy, I think. And so that's why you've got a lot of blowback. But I understand why 60 Minutes did it, but they did a standard 60 Minutes interview, and the rules of the game seem to have changed.
So and again, we're going to rely on history for a minute, but let's kind of take a look back and look at the legacy of 60 Minutes, look at some of those hard-hitting interviews of the days of Mike Wallace. Would this have been on 60 Minutes in this format, in this kind of a profile today, or say 30 years ago, 40 years ago compared to today? I'm thinking of like the interviews with Yasser Arafat.
I can see where it might have been.
Okay.
But I think, I think
that's why we're here.
There might have been more pressing on the answers. Leslie Stahl did, try to press her a little bit. There was the point where, she was sort of reading off some of the things that Greene has posted,
that she believes in,
and finally just kind of rolled her eyes and said, "Wow," which I thought was interesting. But by the same token, Greene didn't really answer a lot of those questions, like when she was asked about name calling and her use of some of her rhetoric, to basically say, well, I think you should ask the other side because they do it too. It's like, well, but I'm talking to you. And I think in the past, and there are a lot of reasons we could speculate on why, but I think the interviewers might have taken a harder line of, no, you can't get away with that. Answer the question.
Yeah, I mean, you're platforming somebody who's anti-Semitic. I mean, it's just a very difficult. I think at a certain point we just have to say there are some views that are beyond the pale, and we're not going to platform them. And that is a very tough decision for news people to make, but that's where we are right now.
Well, and especially thinking about where the country is right now, and to say, well, she is beyond the pale, but knowing that there's a significant chunk of the country that doesn't think so.
I know.
And supports her and supports her caucus. Well, something else happened. Yesterday morning, I got a weird alert that I needed to turn off text two-factor authentication on a department Twitter account that I run. And never mind, I had actually done it about 2.5 weeks ago. That's neither here nor there. What was notable, though, is that KBIA's news director, Ryan Famuliner, pointed out on his personal Twitter account, which bears the blue verification checkmark, that he has not paid for verification through Twitter Blue and never will. And I appreciate the transparency that Ryan and many other journalists are showing this week about it, making clear they're not paying for that check mark. But I have concerns about what's going on in some newsrooms this week as some of these paid check marks are starting to flood the platform, diluting the reliability of tweets from verified newsmakers, and could be leading to more disinformation because we're going to not know right away whether or not something is real or not.
Well, the thing is that one of the interesting things about this controversy is it all blew up this week when Elon Musk took away the blue check mark for the New York Times, saying that it was not a reliable source of information. The point is, the blue check mark was never intended to be Twitter's judgment. And thank you, I really do not need Elon Musk to tell me, as a guy who peddles disinformation, what reliable information is. I think the New York Times has years of reputation to rely on. The blue check mark, when it was originally invented, was to assure people that the person or the organization behind the tweets was actually that person or organization, that Tom Brady really was Tom Brady, that Donald Trump really was Donald
Monica
Trump.
Lewinsky actually was talking about this week on a thread of her own, where she pointed out that there were 3 other people with blue check marks that said Monica Lewinsky was their name, but under the Twitter Blue verification policy, so long as you're paying, as long as it's not Monica Lewinsky's photo with the name and the blue check mark, it's not considered impersonation.
Yeah, so it's ridiculous, and it's why I'm not using Twitter anymore. I mean, I realize different people have made different decisions, but I think that, I really think this is going to be a turning point for all of social media. I think it's such a turnoff but it also points out the other problem of social media, which is they have not figured out a way to monetize the service yet, and it is a real problem. Our generation, not our generation, the Zoomers, have to learn that you have to pay for something you like. But are people going to be willing to pay for Elon Musk's Twitter? I don't think so.
See, and I don't know that I agree with that, if only because we have been saying this for, 4 or 5 months, a year maybe. And as we've been watching what's been going on at news organizations, as we've been watching what's been going on with other notable newsmakers and how they're using the platform, I haven't really seen a whole lot of people. Kathy, I'm with you. Like, I'm barely on Twitter anymore. But I'm not really seeing a whole lot changing in terms of how the industry is using it or approaching it. I mean, even yesterday we were asked to look at our bios for the School of Journalism website and if we wanted to add our Twitter handles to that.
And I mean, that's a good point, thinking about not only how are we using it, how is the industry using it, but the thought had occurred to me earlier this week that it's just kind of a point to sort of rethink or redefine what we think Twitter is, and sort of mentally moving it from this space, ad-driven, that a lot of people can share information and comment on information, to a product. And what am I buying? And thinking of it, I guess, more like a subscription to a publication. So, in a sense of what are people doing with it? And I'm one of those lurker types. I read a lot more on Twitter than I put out there. But it's kind of interesting just having watched where the turn has gone and who is still promoting it on Twitter.
Okay, well, so baseball is back. Kathy, you've got your Pirates. Keith, you've got your Royals and your Cubbies. And with my family in town, the White Sox are streaming on MLB.com at my place this week. The games are shorter, sped up by the new pitch clock. And there's the prediction that the use of new bases means a lot more steals this year. But I want to talk about the reporting on those new bases, because if you look at our links blog, you're going to find examples of 3 stories. One from the Associated Press, one from CBS, and one from Sports Illustrated, all talking about those new bases. They're bigger. They used to be 15 inches by 15 inches. That's about the same size as the lid from an ottoman I keep in my office. I'm holding it up right now if you're watching us on video. Trying to get it into the screen. It's kind of hard next to my face here. But the new bases, they are 18 by 18. I'm going to hand the 15 by 15 to Keith and Kathy and I, because our 18 by 18 little prop we have here, you can see it's much bigger. You can also see we went through all of our closets here at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. But what we've been seeing in those stories, we're going to put the big ones down. Okay, we'll hold up the big one for a second. What we're also seeing, though, Kathy, what's in those stories is that that's not how it was reported. It was reported as 18 by 18. 18 square inches, okay? So 18 inches by 18 inches square is this big one, but 18 square inches, what you can read in each of those stories on our links blog, is that little yellow piece of paper that Kathy's holding there. Put it up just a little bit higher.
For those who are watching, this is about the size of an oversized Post-it, so it would be really hard to slide into.
It really would. And it speaks to, as we're going to put this thing back down, as it speaks to, I've got it, as it speaks to work we've been doing here in how we report on numbers, how we use numbers. This maxim that journalists are bad at math, man, they put it right out there for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those terrible things where people will say, oh, those professors, because probably most people who read the stories knew what we were talking about because they've been to a baseball game. But precision really makes a difference. And for people who don't know, this can be very confusing. So what we are trying to do at the journalism school, many people who go into journalism do so because we are wordsmiths, not as comfortable with numbers. And what I always tell students is, and I would say this especially now with people who are getting news from social media, just because there's a number in it, don't bow down and assume it's right. Question it, just like you would question anything else.
Okay, so the 18 square inches, which isn't actually true. The new bases are actually 325 square inches when you do the 18 by 18 square. Now, Keith, you had shared with me that you had found some really interesting information about the differences in bases.
Well, I started wondering because I tend to be one of those slow to change kind of people. You know, it's like, no, why are they messing with the game? But I know the game has evolved over the years. But I did wonder, okay, when did it become 15 inches square? How far back or how many times has it changed? 15 by 15 was the standard set in the National League in 1877, a year after it was formed. So this is a pretty significant change at the major league level.
Okay, well, we've got almost, 159 more games to watch. That music means we're out of time for this week. I'd like to thank you for spending your last half hour with us. You can read more about each of the topics we talked about today on our links blog. That's on the programs and podcast tab at kbia.org. We're also available wherever you download your podcasts, including iTunes, Spotify, and Stitcher. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle there is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch, listen to the program again, leave comments, questions, see what we'll be talking about next week, and more. Thank you to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show and following along with our props, to Takia Thomas for handling the audio, and Tim Pilcher for composing our theme music. I'm Amy Simons. We'll be back with you next week for another edition of Views of the News.